Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. It's good to see all of you here. My guest sitting to my left, President Duque, obviously you all know very, very well, served as President of Colombia from 2018 to 2022. He also served as a senior advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank earlier in his career. He even served as a senator in Colombia. But most importantly, he would tell you the very highlight of his career is that he leads the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom here at the Wilson Center. So I'm sure the great highlight. Today we are here to talk about his book, which I read some time back and honestly am truly impressed. Mr. President, as I take a look at the index here and scan through, we see a range of topics: climate crisis and the role of Latin America, climate action laws and cabinets, green taxonomy, 30 by 30 designated protected areas, ocean and reef protection, green economies, and so on and so forth. This isn't a book, it is a tour de force. It really is a remarkable capture, I think, of important issues facing the world right now. So, of course, the question is, you finished up as president. You could do a number of things. You could do nothing if you wanted to. Why the book? What caused you to write this?
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Green. Maybe I should say that it's very interesting to present a Green Manifesto in a conversation with Mark Green. I have to begin by saying that the environment has been a passion for me since I was a kid. And during my term in office, I wanted the environment to be one of the most important strategic components of the development agenda for Colombia. And that's why we focus on expanding the protected areas. That's why we focus on the energy transition. That's why we wanted to build a green entrepreneurship and build the pillars of a green economy. So it was president. And then when I finished my term, I figured out, trying to do some autocritic and analysis, that we were able to accomplish lots of things, passing from 13% protected areas to more than 30%, being able to plant 1 million corals, expand the maritime protected areas to more than 38% of the territory, passing from 0.2% of the energy matrix in unconventional renewables to almost 14%, being able to create a circular economy policy, launching what we call the green taxonomy and the New York Stock Exchange, issuing green bonds. And definitely, I thought that it would be interesting to put that into a context of future. Not telling what we did, but being able to tell a story of what should be done when there is presidential leadership and when there is the possibility of building public-private partnerships. So this book, The Green Manifesto, Our Future, works on that. And it basically recommends 16 interventions that, if done correctly, led top down, it will make the Latin American and Caribbean countries not only achieve their NDCs towards 2030, but being able to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. So the way it is written thinking on the future, based on experiences from the region, and based in solid data. And one of the things that I feel very proud is that you will never find a sentence saying, we did that when I was in office. And I make that personal reflection because a good friend of mine and a mentor to me, Enrique Iglesias, the former president of the IDB, who's 92, who's very energetic, he said to me, Ivan, in order to remain young, you need to have more projects than memories. So this is a project that was embraced after the presidency, first post-presidential book. And I'm very glad that this book is now being published in English and has been used now by many heads of state to implement their policies. President Abinader just launched the expansion of the protected areas to reach the 30 by 30. President Ali from Guyana just last week said he's going to duplicate their protected areas in the next 18 months and that he is going to reach the 30 by 30 or even before 30. So all that makes me very happy to not only publish, but now be able to preach with the book for other heads of state to accomplish this 16 steps in order to beat carbon neutrality.
So we won't talk about the past, we'll talk about the future, but one thing I do have to say is those things that you accomplished, and maybe you would say you're putting a down payment on them for the future, was done at the same time you were dealing with COVID, at the same time you were dealing with the largest mass migration in the history of the Americas, and that is, I think, something that is really quite extraordinary. Now, out of all of the book, to me, the most important paragraph is actually in your introduction. And you say that the climate change debate has been focused on political recrimination. Those countries that benefited, while developing countries that are bearing the costs. And that your approach to this doesn't get caught in political recrimination. That is, it seems to me, something unusual these days, because I see lots of people talking at each other and past each other, but what you're saying in this book is that's a waste of time. So talk to me a little bit about that sense of political recrimination and why you think we can't focus on that and how we can get around that.
I think, first of all, we have to recognize that the debate on climate change is not something modern. It's not recent. We have been having conversations about climate change for more than a century. And in fact, when you open the book, maybe in the first pages, there is a sentence from one of the maybe top scientists at the time, and it was in 1856, saying that climate change should be a major concern. 1856. And then I have another sentence that was maybe from mid-20th century that also highlights why climate change should be a major concern. And then I have the final sentence that I included in that page, which came out from the Global United Nations Commission on Climate. So we have a long time to enter into this debate. And obviously, there's no doubt that many countries have developed for many years at the cost of harming the environment. And now, also inside the developing countries, there's this political sense by some people saying, okay, now they want us to stop our development while other countries became rich by harming the environment. I think that is a futile debate. Because I think, and essentially what we need to recognize is that there's no prosperity without nature protection, without climate action, and without the preservation of our maybe biodiversity and ecosystems. So that's why I consider it's a futile debate. Now, saying that, it's also very important, and the book highlights that in many countries, people have made this debate terribly polarizing. And what has made this terribly polarizing is that there are many deniers of climate change, which I consider is not only a mistake, it's quite stupid to deny that. And we were able, in a country that is also politically polarized like Colombia, to pass in the Senate and in the House unanimously a climate action bill. What made that possible? I think that we didn't have deniers of climate change. And from the right, from the left, from the center, all parties recognize that it is the time to act. And for a country like Colombia, it became clear that our sustainability agenda is strategic in terms of economic growth and in terms of generating prosperity. And I mentioned this yesterday. When you look at Colombia, Colombia has one of the lowest amount of emissions per point of GDP compared to the biggest economies in Latin America. And if this is done, used correctly in the narrative and in the way we execute policy, it makes to reaffirm that a dollar invested in Colombia is a much greener dollar than invested in other places in the world. And that should be part of our competitiveness.
And just for a moment on that point, I never hear that case being made. I never hear developing countries that are greener in their approach and greener in their economies. I never hear them make the pitch to the West saying, invest in us, it actually is a better dollar. It helps you and helps our shared challenge. So, so basically, you're making a call to the developing world saying, do this right, and it should be a selling point.
Indeed, and especially considering the need that we have globally for climate finance, or nature finance, or biodiversity finance. You're an expert on Africa, Mark, and you know that Africa has to invest in the next 5 years or 6 years $2.8 trillion for the countries to achieve their NDCs. In the case of Latin America, it's almost the same amount. If we include the Caribbean, it will be slightly above that amount. But those resources are not going to come from our budgetary allocations. Right. We don't have the budget to allocate those big amounts. Neither the philanthropic resources that are available in the world are going to be able to pay those bills, nor the bilateral agencies, nor the multilateral development banks are going to be able to provide that funding. So where is the money going to come from? And that's why there's a special chapter on climate finance, nature finance, biodiversity finance. And that's why, for example, the carbon credit market is important. The development eventually of a biodiversity credit market is important. Having guarantees, having the possibility to issue green bonds with greeniums at discount. So that smart finance is part of the conversation. And since there is a great amount of debt, or debt to GDP, there are limited resources, the only way to make this happen in parallel is by having market-driven, nature-based solutions. And I think that's the big bet that we have to put in when it comes to development and the right investment in climate. And something that is a little bit tries to pick the debate in some of the multilaterals is something that I consider the IMF should do. Because since many countries are restricted due to the amount of debt, or they have great fiscal restraints, there is the possibility that with the IMF, there will be some climate investment to be done now that could be considered below the line in terms of the fiscal deficit calculation, just because if it's invested now, it will be less the pressure on expenditure 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road. And that's something that I also consider will be very important to have in this debate and this discussion. So the book tries to tackle the allocation of resources so you walk the walk and you talk the talk.
So one other, to me, striking element is how you broaden the discussion of what the contributors are to our challenges on this front. So I think the perception that so many hold is that when we are talking about emissions, we're talking about a handful of big oil companies, and that's really about it. Fix that, everything's okay. And one of the points that you make, including looking at your own country, is that deforestation and negative land use are also contributors. And we don't think of it in those terms here in the States. We think of it as only the smokestacks. We don't think about deforestation as being a contributor. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
I think that the book also realizes two debates, and I'll start with deforestation, and then I'll also talk about the hydrocarbon component. So on deforestation and negative use of land, many people don't understand that if deforestation and negative use of land were a country, it will be the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases globally. And it accounts
and
almost...
that never gets made as a point.
Yeah, and it happened. I mean, that's a reality.
Yeah.
And it represents almost 20% of the global greenhouse gases emissions. So where is the deforestation taking place? Most of the deforestation is taking place in developing countries. Yeah. When we look at the Amazon biome in size of territory is almost the same size as the United States of America, more than 7 million square kilometers. And we have lost in the last 4 decades the equivalent in size of France and Germany together. And if the deforestation trend that we have experienced maintains, we are going to see the Amazon no longer being a contention wall, but a net emitter in less than a decade.
Yeah.
So that's very important to highlight. And the same thing happens with the Congo Basin, or the same thing can happen in the case of Indonesia in the south part of Asia. So this is part of the big solution that we need to bring. And how can we make this solution take place? It requires to mobilize resources, accelerate the mobilization of resources, and creating an impact. And that requires a smart finance. And that takes me also to the other conversation, which is about Africa. The reason why I decided to join the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative as part of the steering committee is because if Africa needs to invest $2.8 trillion and the resources available from bilateral, budgetary, and philanthropic resources are not sufficient to match that need, there needs to be a mechanism, and that's why the market mechanism can play a very important role. But that takes us to the price of carbon. That takes us to the speed in which projects are approved without sacrificing the rigor of the approval of those projects. But I also want to go to the part of your question about hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
The hydrocarbon sector is a sector difficult to abate. And many people politically say, okay, we have to shut down the hydrocarbon sector. I don't want to get into the politics of that, but I just believe we're still going to have that molecule available for a long time. Because this is not going to go away in 5 years, 10 years, maybe not 20. It might be having a curve down, but this is going to be present. And the hydrocarbon molecule is going to still be needed to feed the world, to create other mechanisms and products that are crucial for the expansion of the middle class globally. So why not to involve the sector in how the sector can, first of all, reduce its emissions, capture its emissions, and have a more intelligent discussion on how to use the molecule intelligently without harming the whole planet. Miles Allen, who's a great professor of physics at Oxford University, is working on something he calls geological net zero, in which the sector can capture the emissions and can also put the carbon dioxide back into soil. Those are intelligent discussions and not just polarizing politics on this. So we need to move on the negative use of land, but we need to do as much as we can to accelerate the decarbonization of that particular sector, which is a sector difficult to abate, and the same thing should occur with other sectors difficult to abate.
So for the audience, there's a remarkable graph in his book. 20% of the globe's greenhouse gas emissions are due to deforestation and negative land use, which is a striking percentage. And I will say another conversation I had about a year ago with a leader from the oil and gas sector, and he said, now look, understand that in the history of the world, no energy use has ever gone down because the demand keeps growing. So that if you're going to make a long-term difference, you have to be looking prospectively and how you expand energy and new energy sources. Otherwise, you'll never get anywhere in the debate.
Yes, but I think trying to connect that assessment, Mark, I think it's important, first of all, for developed countries to understand how they need to contribute to fight deforestation and negative use of land. And I'll give you this, just this example. The U.S. can do everything good in terms of climate action. But if we do not bring deforestation to zero in the Amazon basin for 2030, we're not going to reach the hemispheric NDCs. So it's not just a single country achieving the NDCs. We have to see this as a whole. And that's why I think there has to be a massive mobilization also of resources to protect not only the Amazon in order to put an end to deforestation, but also something that has never been put in the debate, which is the protection of biodiversity. Many people don't know that in the last 5 decades, we have lost almost 70% of the world's wildlife in the last 5 decades. So protecting biodiversity is as important as any form of climate action. So we're hosting COP16 in Colombia on biodiversity. We're hosting COP29 in Baku, in Azerbaijan. Next year is going to be COP30 in Brazil. But both COPs are interconnected. And the protection of biodiversity, the protection of land, and climate action. They both have to go together. So that's why I, for example, believe there has to be a mechanism in order to protect biodiversity using market mobilization of resources. So I hope that we learn in terms of what we need in integrity, in transparency, in the carbon credit market, and we can put it also in favor of biodiversity. One of the things that the book reflects is on green taxonomies, which was for us something that we embraced in Colombia. And I remember that we listed all the actions, we had all the scrutable indicators, and we decided to go to Wall Street. We went to the New York Stock Exchange and we presented the Colombian Green Taxonomy. And all of a sudden, we understood that the market believed in what we were showcasing just because we had the indicators and we had all the mechanisms to follow how the indicators are accomplished in the short, medium, and long term. And that allowed us to issue the first green bonds in Colombia. And we got a 70% discount that we call it a greenium. And the market was saying, we believe we mobilize resources. We gave some ideas and we exchanged ideas with the Ecuadorian government in President Lazo's term. And President Lazo was very much convinced that he could build a debt swap in terms of having the interexchange of debt for climate action, and particularly the expansion of the protected areas in the Galapagos. And now they also did something for Yasuní. So those kinds of mechanisms are very important, and I hope that more heads of state take the lead of these matters, because this is something also the book reflects.
Yeah.
You can have the best ministers of environment. You can have the best regulation agencies, but if this is not led by the head of state, it won't move at the speed this requires.
Yeah. So, and you just obviously talk a great deal about Colombia, but to me, one of the themes in the book that you keep coming back to is not simply a discussion of Colombia because of obviously your attachment, but that Latin America itself, the larger Latin America, in so many ways is on the leading edge. It's been on the leading edge in terms of feeling the impacts and can be on the leading edge with good leadership in terms of finding a path forward. I mean, I look in the book here, you talk about how climate change has left a deep mark on Latin America. The effects are greater here due to the weakness of social fabric, the limited resources for emergency response, fragile infrastructure, insufficient support networks, as well as challenging geography in the territories. So in many ways, Latin America is on the leading edge in terms of feeling the impact. And in this book, you say that's true, so therefore it must be part of the leading edge looking forward as a model to the world.
So I think what is interesting in the way we describe it, Mark, is that thinking on Latin America, we have many countries that are in the top 30 of the most vulnerable countries to their exposure to climate change.
Yeah.
Colombia is in the top 10, just to give you an idea. And it's going to be turning worst year over year if we don't do what we have to do.
Right.
2020 and 2021, but especially 2020 was the year with more hurricanes category 5 in recent history. For the first time, we had a hurricane category 5 hitting Colombia, and it was Eta and Iota, but Eta in particular destroyed the island of Providence. It was a miracle that we basically didn't have major human loss. We lost, sadly, 2 persons, but it could have been a tragedy. Mm-hmm. And maybe the zone of comfort was that hurricanes never hit particularly, or strong hurricanes, that region. But also the fact that the increase of temperature is having an impact on transmittable disease. Yeah. That we are losing also some of the snowy mountains that are very important as a source of water. That 70% of the world's high altitude ecosystems are located in Latin America. 52% of the world high altitude ecosystems are located in Colombia. that we are maybe the number one region in terms of fresh water allocation, that we have the Amazon biome, that we have, just in South America, three of the largest rivers in the world. You have the Essequibo in Guyana, the Amazon, and that flows through many countries, and you have the Orinoco. Those are facts, and they're also highly exposed to the damage that climate change produces. So the question is, okay, if we're exposed to this, can we be part of the solution? And the response is yes, because we have more than 30% of the arable land, we have the Amazon biome, we have the high altitude ecosystems, we have the sources of fresh water, and we have maybe 5 or more of the top 10 mega diverse countries in the planet. So that's why I think the U.S. shouldn't see Latin America, and I hate that term, the backyard, the front yard. No, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most important place for the U.S. energy security, nature security, food security, and that's why we need to work together
And in your
the
book,
protection.
you're saying that we not only should help in Latin America because of that it's felt the brunt of things, but you're saying it's not possible to meet global challenges and levels if we don't help in Latin America, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you, because something else is, you and I know we have a shared passion for trying to take on some of the challenges of human displacement, forced displacement, and those who are forced into flight. Something in your book that really caught my attention, you have a graph that you've gotten from IOM, the International Organization for Migration, that talks about new displacements in Latin America because of natural disasters in simply the year 2020. And projecting out, so in 2020, 4.5 million people displaced purely because of natural disasters, but that in the current track by 2050, it'll be 17 million in a year. So taking these challenges on is also a prerequisite if we're going to try to deal with the problem of people being displaced far from their homes.
Yes, that's actually one of the things that I think requires a major global discussion, understanding, and action. Migration has become one of the most polarizing issues politically. And, I mean, just look at the conventions season that we have right now is going to be maybe one of the top 3 items that is going to be more discussed or mentioned in all of the speeches. Mm-hmm. And yes, I mean, nobody is talking about the deregulation of illegal migration. Right. Nobody is advocating for that. But we cannot look to the other side when we have causes of massive global migration that are not being neither contained or attended. Mm-hmm. So climate migration is going to maybe get to a point where we're going to have globally more than 70 million people in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. Maybe it can be internal migration for certain countries or other forms of displacement. But it will certainly become, as well, a pressure for international migration. Just to give you numbers and orders of proportion. In the case of India, India has more people below 17 years old than the whole population of North America, including Mexico, the US, and Canada. And India is one of the countries that is highly exposed to the effects of climate change and is one of the most sensible countries with internal migration due to the effects of climate change. If we look at Latin America, the same thing is going to happen. And the question is, how is the world going to address this? Because this will become major humanitarian crisis. And we're going to start seeing in multiple countries people that are going to lose their way of income, that are going to lose their sources of maintaining their families, and that are going to look for the opportunities in which they have a competitive advantage. And this is also aligned, sadly, with other facts. Mm-hmm. And I've been saying this when the discussion comes to the U.S. in the case of the US, there is a labor market transition. More American citizens are moving from handwork to services-driven works. But somebody needs to do those handworks in order to sustain traditional sectors of the economy. And the reason why people cross the border is because they come from developing countries and know that once they cross, they'll multiply their income by the exchange rate, so they'll be able to get a living and maybe send some money back. And especially if they come from countries that have good knowledge in agricultural works, but that are losing those jobs because of the effects of climate change. And it's going to happen in Guatemala, it's going to happen in Honduras, it's going to happen in Nicaragua. So why don't we have a smarter discussion on this and try to solve it instead of trying to contend it? Because what that does is that it triggers an illegal traffic of human beings, which becomes a very lucrative business for many mobs around the world. So if we don't get right the understanding that this climate migration is going to speed up in the next decade, we are going to be trying to solve the illness with the wrong medication.
I could go on forever, by the way. The book is truly fascinating, but a few things I wanted to touch upon in the limited time we have left. One thing that was particularly impressive to me about your book, when you look at the front and you list off some of the different parts of the solution going forward, you don't simply drop them in, you actually work to define them and give examples for recovering diplomats like me who can't even follow some of the topics. Debt for climate, you touched upon it. What does debt for climate mean to you? Explain to our audiences why there is a thing, a term, debt for climate, that it is an important term and opportunity that we need to take on.
So let me begin by saying something. All products, all mechanisms, and all solutions are not created equal. So there has to be climate financial solutions for different countries, for different needs, for different circumstances. So, for example, in the case of Colombia, Colombia has been arguing that Colombia should apply to a mechanism of debt swaps for climate action. You can't really do that in a country that is part of the OECD, that has a manageable level of debt to GDP, and that's why investors nor the development banks are going to look at this with the maybe the attractiveness that it would have in other countries. So I think those debt swaps will be an ideal mechanism for countries that are low income, highly indebted, and highly exposed to the effects of climate change. So give me an example, and I'll begin by giving you the example of the Caribbean. There are many countries in the Caribbean that are highly indebted, that have limited resources for climate action, and that are highly exposed to the climate crisis we face. So how could this product work? For a Caribbean country, they could say, you know, we have this amount of debt, let's say $200 million. It can be bilateral, it can be multilateral, or maybe it can be with the markets. But let's assume it's bilateral or multilateral. What a development bank can do, or a bilateral lender, being the US, France, you name it, can say, okay, we will write off that debt so you don't have to pay it, but you have to demonstrate that you're fulfilling this set of climate actions. But also, since those climate actions require resources, what you're basically saying is the money that you were going to use to pay that debt, great amount of that money has to be part of the climate investment. Because it's not just saying we're going to do it, it's that you have the allocation of resources in order to do it. And that's the smart way of using that mechanism.
Let me give you looking at that another way, a crass way from the perspective of a country like the U.S. There is enormous pressure on the U.S. and donor countries to do debt relief. What you're saying is you can actually get something for it.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You're saying we can get progress here. If there's pressure to do it anyway, why wouldn't you do something that provides a societal good, not just for the country involved, but for the larger world?
In the case of Ecuador, it was a different kind of swap, but it was they had bonds for 1.6 billion dollars that were maybe midterm, and they said we're going to expand the maritime areas of Galapagos, and we want to be able to raise the resources to prepay part of that debt. Well, the fact was that they got a discount of more than $600 million. So they literally got for the country that amount, and it was a way to recognize one of the smartest and maybe more bold decision that was ever made environmentally in Ecuador, which was to increase the maritime protected area of Galapagos and having a great portion of that protected area a no take.
Yeah.
So those products can be very smart.
So everybody wins.
But I want to say something, Mark, and it's not only the national governments. I see a group of friends from the multilateral banks here, and I don't think it's just the national governments. Where the money is much needed as well is at the local governments. And what is happening today with the local governments is that if I am the governor of a state or the mayor of a city, and I want to get IDB, World Bank, CAF lending for the long term for climate action, and in big amount, the national government has to sign a guarantee so that I can get those resources. But in accounting terms, that guarantee is counted for the national government as if it were a loan. So it's taking away many of its indebtment capacity. So that's why there's a great debate whether the national governments are really giving guarantees that are strong enough for the local governments to have a smarter climate action. And that's where I believe at the local level, we could think about some debt relief. At the local level, we can think about guarantees so that they can have long-term funding with a bigger amounts and being focused on the climate needs. And I also believe that we should try to define a specific lending instruments for the local governments where the climate action really requires not only intelligent use of resources, but also building the right technocracy and public management to address those needs, because that's where we have the biggest institutional weakness.
So I'm going to come back to where we began. As I told you, when I look at the book, the most important paragraph is very early on, in which you talk about the recrimination that we see that dominates the debate taking place, and that we have to get past that. You've just explained one way that you get past it, but another way, since you and I are both pro-business conservatives, what impresses me is that this is a book that doesn't focus on punishing business, but collaborating with business, saying you're part of the answer, you have to be part of the answer. Talk about green entrepreneurship and how we can use entrepreneurship and business principles to help make progress on this.
I think there's a nice trend, and I see globally, obviously with some nuances, but I see a more conscient private sector in general, where companies want to embrace the principle of ESG with sound practices, but most importantly, they have also trying to embrace their advance in terms of reaching carbon neutrality. It's very rare that you would speak to a CEO of any public company in any kind of market, whether it's developed or developing, that doesn't have an agenda for decarbonization and to literally be carbon neutral at some point in the next 20 years. So I think that is a major advancement. Second, I am also getting a very powerful message where brands are putting the green aspect of brand consolidation as an intelligent and smart way of keeping their customers attached to a brand. Customers as stakeholders are every day requesting more and more from the brands they use and consume, so that those brands are really meeting important social and environmental standards. And I think last but not least, and this is something that we have to be careful, is that the standards of decarbonization for now, in a majority of the cases, has been decided in the global north. And many of the decarbonization standards that have been set in the global north have not been yet neither calculated nor applied at the global south. And the reason why we have to be cautious is because if we are putting standards that become too costly in the global north, once they come to the global south, and they will have an impact in the overall economy, if this is not done correctly, it can backfire or it can generate a movement against many of the green policies.
The recrimination. the
Exactly.
backlash.
So that's why I think in that discussion, the voice, the arguments of the global south is critical. And something that I think it's an ethical debate is that we have to improve the price of carbon for the global south. Because countries will have to address many, many policies, will have to implement many decisions. But sometimes it's ridiculous what is being paid for a ton of carbon in the global south. And if this is not managed with the right ethics, it's going to make more difficult the massive allocation of resources to the global south. And let me just give you this number. When you look in the case of Africa, Africa could be now almost 6% of the global emissions. But if you really put the weight of the negative use of land, it can be almost 10%, which is almost the same amount of emissions that Europe has today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have to define good pricing, good standards, so that this doesn't backfire once those policies are implemented at the global south level.
Final topic in the limited time we have. So months ago, you and I were sitting down over lunch, and you were talking to me about the importance of green hydrogen, and I didn't pay enough attention. Now more people are talking about green hydrogen. So just a short piece, where you see that at in terms of its development, because I hear from the oil and gas sector that they're intrigued, that there is again a path forward that gets beyond recrimination and involves the private sector.
So I'm going to begin with an anecdote, and it happened when I was president. I had to give a presentation on the green hydrogen perspective and strategy for Colombia. So I found this phrase from Julius Verne, something he wrote more than 100 years ago, where he said, "In the future, energy will come from the boiling and transformation of hydrogen." Julius Verne saying that more than 100 years ago. It was pretty illuminating, as he might have done it when he spoke about man going to the moon. So I said, okay, how can we narrow this debate and pick everybody's brain? We need to diversify the energy. We need to accelerate the energy transition, but we have to get the energy to be affordable, which is very important, and you also need to be able to store the energy and to ensure the confiability of the supply of energy. 3 very complicated challenges. So how can we promote the green hydrogen especially in Latin America? And I'll start with the case of Colombia. You have the northern coast of Colombia. You have a region like La Guajira, where you have wind speeds of 9 meters per second on average, with more sustainability in terms of constant supply of wind than maybe you can get in the north of Denmark. But what you need to do is capture the energy. You need to have the electrolyzers there. Then you need to have a liquefaction process, and then think on green hydrogen and green ammonia to be exported. So you will have a 360 economic structure. By that, everything sounds great. The same thing could happen with solar. You can have big solar farms, you can have the electrolyzers, you can have the liquefaction process, you can produce the green hydrogen, the green ammonia, and then you export. But the challenge is the cost. Because when you put the cost of a barrel of oil and the equivalent of energy in green hydrogen or green ammonia, the price is still very high. So we need to create the right incentives, the right mixes in order to start creating a massive supply of green hydrogen and green ammonia. That hasn't been solved yet, but we need to have those incentives. What I liked about the story is that when we were thinking on the hydrogen route for Colombia, and we installed the first electrolyzers, and we did it with Ecopetrol, the Colombian oil and gas company, I went to the port of Rotterdam, and I went to the port of Anvers, and both cities and both ports were already changing their economic structure so that they could have sites to receive the green hydrogen and the green ammonia, and then being able to supply that energy along Europe and also start changing the energy matrix in the European market. So I believe that's the way in which we have to think, but the transition has to be there. Yeah. If there's people who believe that we can shut down oil and gas tomorrow and then we can move to green hydrogen and green ammonia, that's not going to happen in a nutshell. That's not going to happen in a blink. This is going to take a little bit more time.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see from just our brief discussion that this great book, and it really is a really good read, Our Future, really provides a blueprint for moving forward. And I keep coming back to it, but over and over again, this book is about getting beyond political recrimination and building a constructive path forward. Iván Duque, my friend, it's good to see you. Great work, and I think we have spurned a good discussion. Thank you, and thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Mark, Ambassador Green, and thank you all for being here. And I would just want to finish with this reflection. The center that, thanks to your help and support and your team, Eddie Acevedo, who's here with us, when we created the Iván Duque Center for Freedom and Prosperity, I think the right debate of freedom and prosperity is also involved in the way we have a greener future, a greener economy, and a sustainable economy. There's no way we'll have prosperity nor freedom if we don't address many of the things that are presented in this book. So thank you all, and it has been a pleasure to share this morning. I know there's going to be some book signing.
I was just going to say.
So thank you for being here.